Hello, this is OPA Sociology, and today we're going to be looking at what are primary sources. So just for the first 5 minutes, you've got a free marker here. Identify and describe what is meant by the self-fulfilling prophecy. So this is relating to interactionist theory, and it's been deliberately chosen because it's one of the theories that the class are slightly weaker on. So try to answer that using the DIE approach. Remember, define, importance, example, and as a stretch and challenge, what other key concepts are associated with that theory? Okay, give yourself 5 minutes, time conditions to answer that question. Right, so in class, we would have peer marked this. I'm just going to give you an example of where you'd get your marks from. So for the definition, the self-fulfilling prophecy is the process which individuals live up to a label about them. Okay, so that's 1 mark there. It is important as it demonstrated how small-scale social interaction can influence shaping individuals. And then I could really just say one of the following words: identity, norms, roles, values. Any of those would have been fine. And an example of it. So an example of this would be a student being told by a teacher they are naughty. The student would develop a self-concept of this and then become naughty in their everyday interaction. There you go, 3 marks, 1 for each part. And it's very similar as well for the 4 markers, to be fair. So you can either have a look through this, compare it to yours, maybe write this one down just as an example. But here you've got the structure very clearly outlined. Right, moving on to the main part of the lesson. So just for the first task, if you could write down this concept for what a primary source is. So a primary source, or primary sources rather, are types of data collection by the researcher themselves as part of their research project. So essentially, it's the sociologists getting their hands dirty, actually conducting their own research. So for task 2, if you could perhaps draw this table out that you can see on the left-hand side, because we're going to identify the different types of primary sources now, both from the sort of positivist and quantitative approach, and also those from an interpretivist and qualitative approach. And as a stretch and challenge, you can see there, any characteristics you associate with the approach, just write them down, but we're not necessarily going to directly go through them. So I just maybe pause the video, just give yourself a bit of time to write these down. Right, so let's go through that. So the first bit, for the quantitative, what do they look for in primary sources? So they're looking for essentially 2 things. They're looking for research that has large samples, because they want a representative picture of social behavior. So they want essentially lots of people, and they want to reflect those sort of social identities within that population. So let's say, for example, if there's 60% men, then they're going to want 60% men reflected in their samples, or as close to that as possible. Or let's say it's 50% are middle class, they want 50% middle class reflected in their samples. They want their smaller version of that smaller microcosm to reflect the bigger one. It's called generalizability. And then the second thing, they're looking for reliable data. So that is data that can be repeated. Okay, it can be replicated. So let's say if we had 2 researchers researching exactly the same thing on the exact same day with no different variables, they should come out with the same data. Or it might be just that you're researching something in one place compared to another, and it should really be standardized. Okay, that's what it means by reliability. There's something that is easily repeatable. So 2 things there: large sample and reliability. And these generally are in the form of structured questionnaires, structured interviews, surveys, and experiments. Anywhere they can really control what is being asked, okay, that is uniform, standardized across the board. So there's no deviation by the researcher. And then on the flip side, we have the qualitative approach. So the qualitative approach just wants validity. Okay, it wants rich data, meaning lots of depth and lots of detail. It wants a picture of the social reality being studied, and they think they can only achieve that not through a representative sample, but through lots of information, lots of detail. And because it's in a lot of detail, they're not really worried about the samples or how many people taking part. Okay, it's more about the quality there as opposed to the quantity. And it's often unorganized, deliberately so they can get fresh insights, and they're not really restricted in what they ask in order to get that detail. So because it's unorganized, it's not very reliable. They're not worried about reliability. They say it's impossible or it's impractical. And generally that's achieved through unstructured interviews, unstructured questionnaires, and then some of these we haven't gone through yet, but longitudinal studies, ethnographics or ethnographies, and observations. Right, so there are reasons for using quantitative and qualitative approaches, with the weaknesses of one approach being the strengths of the other. So for example, the strengths of quantitative research is that it's reliable. That's not a strength of qualitative data. Whereas on the flip side, qualitative data is very valid, has a lot of validity, whereas quantitative doesn't. So really, they're the polar opposites really in their strengths and weaknesses. So just have a think, just a reflection, what could sociologists do to solve this issue? Right, so what they do is it's referred to as take up a mixed methods approach. Okay, so this mixed method approach, it attempts to take the strengths of a quantitative approach, so reliability, with the strengths of a qualitative approach, validity. So they'll have perhaps two forms of methodology brought together. So they might have, I don't know, a structured questionnaire that's reliable, and then follow that up with a unstructured interview, which is rich in validity. So it's when you're using the strengths, you're trying to achieve the strengths of both quantitative and qualitative approaches. And you might want to draw this out, seeing as you haven't got the handouts. And this process of mixed methods and achieving the strengths of both approaches is called triangulation. Okay, so when you're joining up really all the dots. So just to give an example of that, Bob wants to see if divorce has increased in Grays over the last 50 years. So the first thing Bob does in part 2 is he completes a structured questionnaire of 5,000 people in Grays. That's going to be really representative because it's a big sample, but it's also going to be really reliable. But in part 3, to make up for the lack of validity, they're going to do perhaps an unstructured interview of 50 people in Grays. Okay, just so that they can really get into the depths and follow up on some of those answers in the questionnaires. And then for the fourth part, you're just reflecting on that data. So you're reflecting on both the correlations established in the questionnaires, as well as some of the answers in the interviews. Again, I'd make sure you get this triangulation example down. It's a good one. And then finally, just the strengths and weaknesses here of using a mixed method approach. So just rattling through the strengths, it gains, as we said, the strengths of all the approaches, reliability, so it's easily repeated. It's representative because it's got a big sample. It gains validity because it follows up maybe with an unstructured interview. Okay, so it has depth to it. Okay, and it attempts to see sociology from lots of different points of view, some of a scientific one and an anti-scientific one, there's all sorts. But some of the weaknesses of it can be expensive and time consuming. And many argue really it's trying to simplify the complex nature of both the positivist and interpretivist approach. It doesn't want to make a compromise, either of those approaches, some of those sociologists would say.